Sam Shonkoff is the Taube Family Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies here at the GTU, where he teaches on Jewish religious thought, modern Jewish cultures, and methods in theology, ethics, and the historical cultural study of religions. His research focuses primarily on German Jewish thought and Hasidism, as well as, I was going to say interpretations. Here it says appropriations, but I know your thinking is evolving on this. As well as appropriations of Hasidic spirituality in relatively secular spheres. His current book project investigates themes of embodiment in Martin Buber's representations of Hasidism vis-a-vis the original sources. He is co-editor with Ariel Evan Mays of Hasidism, Writings on Devotion, Community, and Life in the Modern World. And he is also editor of Martin Buber, His Intellectual and Scholarly Legacy. His talk today is titled Assimilation, Sovereignty, Diaspora, The Politics of Mystical Death from a Jewish Perspective. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you, Roni and Joel. I'm mindful of time, so I'm just going to hop right in here. Despite the vast phenomenological diversity of experiences reported in traditions throughout human history, modern definitions of mysticism have centered upon experiences of union, that is, moments of mystical death, wherein one's sense of individuated self dissolves into infinite divinity. Starting in the mid-19th century in Europe and North America, it became commonplace for scholars of religion and religious seekers alike to identify such experiences as the common core of all legitimate religions. This perennialist approach imagined an essence of religion that lies beneath all the external trappings of ritual practice, social formations, etc. In the 21st century, Lee Eric Schmidt and others have demonstrated the extent to which this mystical discourse reflected not only Protestant sensibilities, but also, moreover, the modern European project of liberalism. Amid liberal humanist efforts to determine how different religious groups might coexist civilly, many embraced visions of self-dissolution into a supposedly universal all that just happened to resonate with liberal Protestant theologies. Here today, I want to contemplate the politics of mysticism through a Jewish cultural historical lens in order to hopefully shed some new light on the modern category of mysticism as well as modern liberal politics, including modern Jewish politics. Indeed, while scholars such as Leora Batnitsky, Amir Mufti, and Sarah Hammerschlag have shown how attention to the so-called Jewish question illuminates foundational blind spots, complexities, and dangers of liberalism, I want to build on that scholarship through demonstrating how discourse about Judaism among the architects of modern mysticism reveals a great deal about that very category of mysticism and its entanglements with liberalism. My study refracts this material through the prism of three different pathways in modern Jewish politics: assimilation, sovereignty, and diaspora. In the 19th century, mystical fascinations with self-dissolution correlated with the liberal project of assimilation. Indeed, spiritual visions of annihilating individuation harmonized with political visions of melting minority identities into the unified whole of state citizenry, a sort of theological political melting pot, if you will. While the case of supposedly indissoluble Jewish particularity in bodily practice and in social identity haunted the architects of liberalism, the progenitors of modern mysticism had their own version of this Jewish question. Scholars of mysticism tended to portray Judaism as a stark antithesis. Quote, "Judaism and mysticism are irreconcilable opposites," declared one Meister Eckhart scholar in 1868. Quote, "The Jewish mind is hardly compatible with mysticism due to its rigid monotheism and its turn towards worldly realism and statutory observance," explains the Encyclopedia Britannica's entry on mysticism in 1910. William James simply did not mention Judaism in his lectures on mysticism and the varieties of religious experience. Even as late as 1960, the Yale philosopher Walter Stace, whose definition of mysticism continues to be cited routinely in psychedelic studies today and forms the theoretical basis for that field's quite foundational mystical experience questionnaire, claimed that, quote, Judaism is perhaps the least mystical of all the great world religions, due to its practitioners' apparent resistance to dissolution, even Stace suggests that such dualistic or particularistic elements in Christianity exist only because, quote, Christianity inherited it from Judaism. In short, just as early liberals exhibited anxieties about whether Jews could ever fully assimilate into a universal but actually liberal Protestant Eurocentric humanism, so too the mystical discourse associated with that liberal project critiqued Judaism for its resistance to absorption into a universal but actually culturally situated divinity. In the 20th century, it appears that Jewish scholars of religion increasingly recognized correlations between enlightened assimilation and mystical absorption, and some intervened accordingly. Perhaps it's no coincidence that Stephen Katz, whose 1978 essay, Language, Epistemology, and Mysticism, launched the constructivist, contextualist turn in the study of mysticism, was a Jewish studies scholar. However, the seeds of this shift emerged already at the dawn of the century. At that time, in addition to the universalist humanist approach to mysticism, there arose more ethnically, religiously particular perspectives among scholars from various backgrounds. Much like folklore, for example, mysticism became a nationalist discourse. In fact, one can hardly understand the emergence of the very category of Jewish mysticism beyond this frame. When Martin Buber introduced this idea and defended it of Jewish mysticism in his introduction to his first Hasidic anthology in 1906, he cast it as surging, quote, from an original characteristic of the people, des Volkes, that generated it, revealing the hidden reality of the folk soul, Volksseele. And Buber explained elsewhere that it was his Zionism that propelled his turn toward Hasidism in the first place. This was also true for Gershom Scholem, who founded the academic field of Jewish mysticism. And like Buber, Scholem portrayed Jewish mysticism as a fundamentally internal Jewish outpouring, essentially independent of any external influences. Moreover, it's especially significant for our purposes that Scholem claimed that Kabbalah lacks experiences of mystical union. The fact that this is a rather gross overstatement, as Moshe Idel and others have shown, makes Scholem's claim even more intriguing. Indeed, as Boaz Huss has suggested, Scholem's repudiation of mystical death reflects his own Jewish nationalism. Thus, if absorptive mysticism mapped onto a politics of Jewish assimilation, then this later approach correlates with a politics of Jewish sovereignty. Whereas the former embraces the death of the I, the latter amounts to a denial of death. Notably, this nationalist Jewish mysticism, like other nationalist mysticisms of its time, does not overcome perennialism so much as refigure it. If the assimilationism model locates a common core spanning all religions, then the sovereignty model locates a perennial core within the nation itself. At this juncture, then, we might explore possibilities for an alternate model of mystical experience, if that phrase is even worth preserving, that is neither assimilationist absorption nor nationalist essentializing, one that is more dialectical than either perennialism or constructivism. On one hand, there is no view from nowhere, no pure immediacy that is culturally neutral. Humans are always already hermeneutical beings. On the other hand, no cultural frame, biographical positionality, or personal intention has total sovereignty over one's spectrum of possible experiences. There are, dare I say, human, as well as more than human elements that transcend and transform our situated selves, and the continually shifting shapes of our lives alter those surroundings in turn. The study of those experiences called mystical ought to examine such hermeneutical, phenomenological, and ecological dynamisms. From this perspective, selves, both individual and collective, are neither dissolvable nor perennial, but rather decentered and dispersed. The politics of mysticism here is neither one of assimilation nor sovereignty, but we might say one of diaspora. Here, scholars can trace the particular contours of selves and collectivities while also surveying what is borderless, where spiritual depths and metamorphoses may reflect transcendence, but do not simply signal some pseudo-universalism or cosmopolitanism that always, in the end, proves parochial. There have been efforts in recent decades of religious studies to formulate more nuanced approaches to the study of mysticism. On one hand, contra the romanticizing of mystical death in all-out absorptive mysticism, Grace Jansen and other feminist scholars have demonstrated how that discourse not only draws upon insidious binaries of masculine spirituality versus feminine materiality, but also imagines the mystical subject as a sort of neutral identity that, when spiritually dissolved, can then simply roam about the world without being gendered or racialized in our earthly realm, a sign of hegemonic privilege if there ever was one. On the other hand, regarding constructivism, even Stephen Katz himself, often cited as the radical constructivist par excellence, emphasizes that particular traditions do change over time, given cultural and political circumstances, and he prefers to identify merely as a contextualist. More recently, Jorge Ferrer has indicated that while the linguistic turn in religious studies was in many ways an effort to overcome the reductionist tendencies of earlier phenomenologists of religion like Rudolf Otto and historians of religion like Mircea Eliade, the resultant discourse that Jürgen Habermas calls the linguistification of the sacred involves its own reductionism. Ferrer proposes a participatory turn, wherein scholars observe not only the verbal textual shapers of mystical experiences that underscore stark differences, but also no less, quote, the importance and at times even centrality of non-linguistic variables, for example, somatic, imaginal, energetic, contemplative, and so on, in shaping religious experiences and meanings, end quote. This builds upon Ferrer's earlier work that called upon scholars to observe how so-called mystical experiences are, quote, multi-local epistemic events that can emerge not only in the locus of an individual, but also in a relationship, a community, a collective identity, end quote. In such a methodological framework, the self is indeed decentered and dispersed, and even if dissolved psychologically in some non-ordinary state, still remains embedded culturally, spatially, and temporally, while also reciprocally reshaping those sets and settings. It's always illustrative to turn to concrete examples from particular traditions. Before doing so, however, we must bear in mind that shifting from the typological simplicities of absorptive assimilationist or folkish nationalist, there is no archetypal exemplary experience for this participatory diasporic approach. This is a crucial point. There is no set of phenomenological criteria that are deemed supreme, against which all other testimonies must be measured. Rather, the scholar surveys a complex, interactive web of conditions that catalyze and mediate different kinds of religious experiences. This is a hermeneutical approach, though one that transgresses merely linguistic boundaries. So with that caveat, qualification, we can now consider an example. And I'd like to conclude here with a turn to the late 18th century, early 19th century Hasidic sage, Rebbe Nachman of Bratslav. We can observe some key aspects of this participatory diasporic approach at play in Rebbe Nachman's own outlook. This is clear in how he describes his practice of hitbodedut, solitude, or more precisely, a form of solitary prayer, which he himself described as greater than every other practice and a general principle that encompasses everything. First of all, Nachman insists that Hitbodedut draws directly upon the surrounding ecosystem, outside any bounded subjectivity or tradition. He reports that when he would return from secluding himself in forests and fields, the whole world appeared new to him. It seemed as if it were an entirely different world, end quote. The fact that seclusion among plant life occasions a sort of death of worldviews was no mere metaphor in Nachman's eyes. Riffing on a classical rabbinic identification of prayer with the biblical phrase lasuach basadeh, to meditate in the field, or siach basadeh, or sicha basadeh, a conversation in the field, Nachman links this with a different verse, siach hasadeh, shrubs of the field, to muse upon how, quote, when you pray in the field, all the plants, all of them, enter your prayer, assist you, and energize your prayer. Even when you do not pray in the field, your prayer is still assisted by the produce of the land, through those things that are near you, such as your food and drink, etc. It's just when you're in the field, you are closer to produce, end quote. The states of consciousness generated in Hitbodedut are inseparable from local vegetation. And for Nachman, one is not only under the influence of the produce of the place, but also of the local tongue. Quote, this prayer and conversation should be in the language that you speak, such as Yiddish, as it is difficult to express such a conversation in the holy tongue, Hebrew. The heart is not drawn after words in a language that we're not used to speaking, but with Yiddish, in which we speak and spin tales, it is much easier to break open the heart, end quote. Quite self-consciously, then, Rebbe Nachman's mysticism is not simply internal to himself or to his tradition. Subjectivity and scriptures alike are dispersed and discentered, drawing vitality from contextual elements. Receptivity here is key. In fact, Nachman sensed that it was precisely when he emptied himself out in a kind of kenosis that his most revelatory Torah could emerge. He made this a practice. After speaking his most erudite Torah to his Hasidim, he would sit back and say, I know nothing. He asked at times what it even means to be Jewish. This is an ultra-conservative Rebbe asking what it means to be Jewish. The principle, his disciple Nassan of Nemirov explained, is that he never remained at one stage, but rather moved fluidly from stage to stage. Even when he attained what he attained, his mind would not freeze there. One recalls here the Maggid of Mezrich's early Hasidic teaching that every transformation, whether that be psychological growth in human beings or biological metamorphoses from seeds to springlings or eggs to chicks, involves passing through ayin, nothingness. There's a kind of death here, a radical letting go that enables transformation. And yet this is not simply a dissolving into some universal all in order to transcend one's situatedness. It is rather a death in service of renewing and revisioning one's tradition and world. One of the most evocative Hasidic images for this principle is the eagle, who continually renews its youth through shedding its feathers, again drawing upon a classical teaching but in a new key. Nachman himself identified with this eagle. In what Bretzlav Hasidim tend to regard as the most significant story he ever told, the tale of the 7 beggars, the eagle says to him, you are like me, since you are very old, but still completely infantile. You have not yet started to live at all, but you are nonetheless very old. Here, there is an interpenetration of death and birth in what Nachman's disciple termed real life. This newfound vitality, born from a readiness for decay, is the stuff of Renaissance. The politics of this mysticism are not so clear as to determine some particular party or platform. But one thing we can say, it seems to me, is that an appreciation of the decentered and dispersed self resists the false binary of perennialist assimilationism versus essentialist nationalism. We might hold in tension the inevitability of cultural situatedness with the metamorphic impact of contextual conditions at all times. Traditions, in the broad sense, are always shaping us, as do cosmic and cultural elements all around us. And yet there is also the fertilizing force of death, the possibility of shedding feathers and renewing worldviews, which might illuminate unknown pathways ahead. Thank you.